the argument I want to propose or present today is a small article I've published before in the Ukrainian press on Novoye Vremya. A summary in English has come out in the Harvard International Review, and the long version is forthcoming in the Brown Journal of World Affairs. And the argument of this article is that Ukraine has 6 scenarios for its future, and I focus here exclusively on the issue of national security and international embeddedness and of an inclusion of Ukraine in an international security structure. And the reason I do so is that I think that the domestic development of Ukraine is, of course, still very stormy and very complicated. But because of the change of the structure of domestic affairs after the Euromaidan, namely the continuing mobilization of the civil society, the deep involvement now of international organizations, of the IMF, the EU, the World Bank, other actors in the Ukrainian domestic process, and also the engagement of the Ukrainian diaspora in Ukrainian internal affairs. Because of these factors, I think the reforms will sooner or later succeed. Maybe later rather than sooner, because there's now sort of a stagnation period or a reactionary period in Ukraine these days. But I think this will trigger a new wave of reform, maybe even a new Euromaidan, maybe a new political confrontation in Kyiv. But sooner or later, I think, because of the different structure that Ukrainian domestic affairs has after the Euromaidan, I think the reform process will succeed, and Ukraine will basically repeat the development, maybe not so much of Poland, but of the Balkan countries, of Romania, Bulgaria, the Western Balkan countries. So I think this is not yet a done deal, of course. It's an ongoing fight, but I think this ongoing fight will be, at the end of the day, won by the reform forces. And that could lead one to think of the future of Ukraine in positive, optimistic terms. But unfortunately, that is not the case because the question of national security and international embeddedness remains. And for that, there are 6 scenarios. They can be divided into one likely scenario, which is the continuation, basically, of the current gray zone status of Ukraine, and 5 less likely scenarios, 5 scenarios that would mean the conclusion of a new large treaty for Eastern Europe with Ukraine, of different kinds of treaties that could be signed in these different 6 or remaining 5 scenarios. And they would all change the geopolitical structure, basically, of Eastern Europe. So the 6 scenarios are the one I mentioned already, the gray zone. The second one would be a grand bargain between the West and Russia. The third one would be the accession of Ukraine to NATO. The fourth, the accession of Ukraine to the European Union. The fifth, a conclusion of a treaty between Ukraine and the United States within, for instance, the major non-NATO ally status scheme of the United States. And the 6th scenario, an Intermarium or an East European security alliance between the Baltic and the Black Seas. So let's go through these 5 scenarios. As mentioned, the gray zone scenario, basically the continuation of the current situation that we have now, is the most likely. And it is maybe even the scenario that one should only discuss about from a realistic point of view, because all the others are far less likely and therefore maybe less worth discussing. But the problem with the current scenario, with the continuation of the current situation into the future, is, of course, that the current situation of Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova being in these sort of geopolitical gray zone between NATO and the Russia-dominated organizations, the CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Union. The problem with this scenario is, of course, that this is exactly the scenario that got us into the complicated, difficult situation Ukraine is in today. And there is so far little reason to believe that a simple continuation of the current situation in the future will somehow be less problematic than the last 3 years, let's say. So while this is the most likely scenario, is also a risky scenario, and one does not have to speculate much about the future here. One can simply refer to the experience of Georgia, of Moldova, of Ukraine. During the last 25 years, these countries have become failed states, basically, because they do not control fully their state's territory, and a continuation of the scenario is therefore risky. There might be a chance through many baby steps, many small improvements, cooperation schemes, support schemes, to improve this scenario to a degree that it would be less risky than it looks now. But there's also risk, I think, to believe that that Ukraine can somehow solve this problem, the security problem, for itself. I think one has to acknowledge that the slogan one hears here often in Kyiv, that Ukraine has to go its own way and has to solve by itself her own problems. It's very sympathetic, and I like it very much. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's realistic. Ukraine needs help from other countries to get into a sustainable security situation, and so there's the danger here, in a way, to assume that somehow Ukraine can solve this security issue itself. So one should perhaps discuss in more detail what kind of baby steps, as I call them, should the West and Ukraine should take to improve this gray zone scenario. But I will not go into that here now in more detail. I think the steps are well known. European integration, the delivery of lethal weapons, political risk insurance for foreign direct investment. These are all sort of steps that the West and Ukraine could take together to improve this scenario. But I will not go here more into these many schemes one could imagine within this scenario. Instead, I want to discuss the second scenario, which I think is the most popular one, both in the West and also with many people in Moscow. And this is the conclusion of a grand bargain between the West and Russia, involving Ukraine or not involving Ukraine. That is sometimes left sort of unclear. The problem with a bargain between the current Russia and the West is that for the creation of some sort of sustainable security situation in Eastern Europe, Russia would probably demand concessions. Like, for instance, as was proposed in a recent paper in Germany, the West could or should offer to Russia a permanent exclusion of Ukraine from NATO and the European Union, something like that. The problem with this is, of course, that it ignores Ukraine's national interests. That is the big issue here in this grand bargain scenario, how this scenario would take care of Ukraine's national interests. The second problem is that we had already a number of agreements between Russia and the West, the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, the Geneva Declaration of 2014, the Minsk agreements, and so on, and many more agreements concerning Eastern Europe or the post-Soviet sphere, and that many of these agreements have been later on violated by Russia. And the final point about this scenario is that this scenario would basically further undermine the international regime for the prevention of the proliferation of nuclear weapons. This is the story about the famous Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which has now been violated. The importance of the Budapest Memorandum is not lies not in the document itself, but lies in the fact that the Budapest Memorandum connects the issue of Ukraine's territorial integrity, political sovereignty, with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, the so-called Treaty for the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. The violation of the Budapest Memorandum by Russia since 2014, and one could argue there were already violations before 2014, undermines the logic of the non-proliferation regime. If now the West and the other signatories of the Budapest Memorandum, namely the United States and Great Britain, would agree to some sort of limitation of Ukraine's sovereignty in a grand bargain with Russia, that would be a further undermining of the Budapest Memorandum and of the logic of the non-proliferation regime. It would mean that the Budapest Memorandum is not only from Russia's point of view meaningless, but also from the does not have to be fully observed from the side of the Western depository states of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I think these are the three problems with the grand bargain: Ukraine's national interests, the unreliability of Russia with these sort of multilateral and bilateral agreements, and the integrity not only of Ukraine as a state, but also of the international non-proliferation regime. The third scenario is perhaps the most popular one in Ukraine as well as in Georgia, and that is Ukraine's and Georgia's accession to NATO. That is also my favorite, so to say, scenario. I would certainly be in favor of it. I think it would be the ideal scenario for Ukraine and Georgia. Moldova has declared itself bloc-free in 1994. It does not aspire to NATO membership. But the problem with this scenario is that it is, as far as I can see, highly unlikely. The sort of structural issue that Ukraine and Georgia have here is that NATO is not a supranational organization. It's an intergovernment organization, and the question about membership in this organization is not decided by the bureaucrats and the officers of NATO, but by the 29 member states of NATO, now 29 after the accession of Montenegro. And each of these 29 member states is represented in the so-called North Atlantic Council, and each of them has a veto right. So all of them would have to unanimously agree to an accession of Ukraine and Georgia to NATO membership. And my assessment is that there would be, as long as Georgia and Ukraine have these territorial conflicts with Russia, there will be always European member states of NATO that would vote against NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. There would be, I could imagine there could be East European member states that would be in favor of Ukraine's and Georgia's accession to NATO. The two North American states, Ukraine and Canada, may be in favor of an accession of Ukraine and Georgia to NATO. But there would be at least a few, maybe even many West European member states that would be against a membership. And therefore, I think the conclusion one has to draw from this, yes, one should certainly intensify cooperation with NATO as far as possible. Ukraine should also prepare itself for NATO membership. It should change the standards of its army. It should maybe conduct a referendum at some point on NATO membership. But it should not, I think, invest too much time, energy, and hopes into a soon accession to NATO. The absurd situation is unfortunately, that Ukraine and NATO and Georgia will only become NATO members when, in fact, they may not need NATO membership that much anymore. When they will have resolved their conflicts with Russia, then NATO membership becomes possible. And it has been promised already in the 2008 Bucharest Declaration of NATO. But then when the problem with Russia is solved, actually, Ukraine and Georgia do not have any other major security issues. They will not need NATO membership that much anymore. So this is the absurd, paradoxical situation that these countries are now in with regard to Ukraine and Georgia. And the conclusion for me, for both for the Western friends of Ukraine and Georgia, and for the political and intellectual elites of Georgia and Ukraine, is that they should invest more time and energy in searching for alternatives, because it is an illusion to think that if only Georgia and Ukraine will knock loud enough at the door of NATO, then NATO will open its door at the end of the day. I think that is what many think here, what many believe, that the problem so far has been simply that Ukraine and Georgia have not been knocking loud enough at the door of NATO, and if they do so, then they will become NATO members. I don't think that will work, actually, and therefore one has to think about alternatives. And that leads me to the fourth scenario, which I think is underestimated often. That is Ukraine's accession to the European Union. There's no official membership perspective for Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova so far. They have these large association agreements with the European Union, but these association agreements do not contain a membership perspective, unlike, for instance, the association agreements that the EU has with the Western Balkan countries that include a membership perspective. Nevertheless, I think these association agreements are in fact a preparation of Moldova, Ukraine and Georgia for membership. And once they are implemented, I think membership becomes not only possible for Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, but actually likely, because these agreements, they are actually, I think, misnamed. They should not be called association agreements. They are de facto, and one could even argue de jure in a certain sense, integration agreements, because they integrate Georgia, Moldova and Ukraine into the economic and legal sphere of the European Union, which means that once these agreements are implemented, the last step towards full membership will be actually a relatively small one. So I think EU membership is certainly a very realistic scenario, although there are no official statements so far from Brussels on this. But the problem with this scenario is that the implementation of the association agreements, which would be the prerequisite for the start of membership negotiations, will take several years more. I would guess between 10 and 15 years, and then these three countries will get a membership perspective. Then they will start membership negotiations. And so I would estimate that within approximately the next 20 years, these three countries will become members of the European Union. And membership of the European Union would greatly increase the security of these countries. The European Union is not a defense alliance, it's not a military alliance, but nevertheless, the members of the European Union are so closely linked to each other that if these three countries will indeed become members of the European Union, that will also automatically increase their security situation. I can imagine, for instance, that today Estonia's membership in the European Union may be more important for Estonia's security than Estonia's membership in NATO. That is because the European Union would, of course, react to a Russian advance into Estonia, let's say into the largely Russian city of Narva, with much harder, much more far-reaching sanctions than currently the EU is reacting to the invasion of Ukraine, and I think that is the major protection mechanism for Estonia today. I think there would be many people in Moscow who would love to actually, let's say, take Narva and then show the world that NATO cannot do anything about it, because Narva is a largely Russian city. Probably the Russian soldiers in Narva would not encounter much resistance from the local population, and it would be an excellent opportunity for Russia to show NATO that it is not effective. NATO wouldn't be able to do much in such a situation, because it wouldn't be able to bomb a city. So I think the European Union actually is providing here for Estonia security, and in that way also the European Union would be providing security for, because of its economic leverage, less so with military power, for Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova when they become EU members. The problem again being that this is still 10, 15, 20 years away. Which then leads me to the fifth scenario, which is a separate treaty between Ukraine and the US, maybe also involving Great Britain, maybe within the major non-NATO ally scheme that the US has for international allies that are not members of NATO. Ukraine was already actually once close to this. In December 2014, there was it was discussed the provision of the major non-NATO ally status to Ukraine. It was even already in a draft law, but at the 11th hour, this provision of this status was excluded from this law, and unfortunately, Ukraine did not become a major non-NATO ally of the US. In spring 2017, the Verkhovna Rada has issued a resolution, a declaration, an appeal to the US to make Ukraine a major non-NATO ally. And rightly so, I think the Verkhovna Rada has referred in this resolution to the Budapest Memorandum, again, about which I talked already. And one could then maybe add to such a treaty that could be signed also Great Britain, because Great Britain was also a signatory state of the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 and is a depositary state of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. However, the argument, I think, in the resolution of the Rada was a bit unfortunate, because the Rada referred only to the Budapest Memorandum itself and the promises that Ukraine had received in the Budapest Memorandum. I think the argument for Ukraine here to upgrade the security assurances of the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 should not so much refer to this deal of 1994 itself and to Ukraine's national interests and the various other arguments that the Rada has put forward in this resolution. It's about democracy and freedom and so on. But the argument here of the Ukrainian side should be rather about the non-proliferation regime and the damage that Russia's behavior has done to the non-proliferation regime. Russia has used its special status as an official nuclear weapons power under the non-proliferation regime to secure its occupations in Crimea and in the Donbass. It is clear that one of the major, if not the major, reason that the West has not gotten involved itself into this whole conflict militarily is because Russia has nuclear weapons. Therefore, Russia has undermined the logic of the non-proliferation regime. It has basically shown to the world that if you don't have nuclear weapons like Ukraine, then you will be a victim, or you can become a victim to territorial expansion by neighboring states. And if you have nuclear weapons like Russia has, you can basically do what you want, because the others will be afraid of you, and they will not dare to become militarily active against you. So the argument here could be of Ukraine, in order to strengthen the non-proliferation regime, the US and Great Britain should upgrade their security assurances of 1994 and give actually much more explicit security guarantees to Ukraine. Often this has been wrongly translated into Ukrainian. The security assurances have been translated into Гарантії безпеки, security guarantees into Ukrainian. That is not actually the case. Ukraine has not received security guarantees in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, and it could argue now that it should receive security guarantees, not only in the interests, and that would be not only in the interests of Ukraine, but also in the interests of the entire humanity, because that would strengthen the logic of the non-proliferation regime. It would show everybody in the world that if you give up voluntarily your nuclear weapons, other countries will step up and will protect your political sovereignty and territorial integrity. I think that should be the argument, and I think there's a chance to get this. The problem here is, of course, that there's such a mess in Washington these days that we don't know what will happen, in the next year in Washington. We don't even know for sure what will happen in the next month. There could be a very pro-Ukrainian turn in Washington. There could be a pro-Russian turn in Washington. There could be a new president. It's a very volatile situation in Washington, and therefore one cannot really count on this particular scenario. This would be a best-case scenario if the administration in Washington becomes very pro-Ukrainian and the Congress becomes ready to go forward with a major non-NATO ally status. That would be, of course, very good for Ukraine. But so far, one cannot really see that happening because we simply don't know how Washington will develop in the next months. That leads me then to the sixth scenario, which is in a way maybe the most fantastic one. It's the Intermarium scenario, which the term refers back to the interwar period when this term became prominent. It was used primarily by Poland for the idea of creating, after World War I, an alliance of the East European successor states of the different empires in order to protect these small East European successor states from a revisionist Germany and a revisionist Russia, which then really happened when Germany became fascist and Russia and Soviet Russia then also became revisionist. And the idea back then was that these successor states of the empires in Eastern Europe, they are in a geopolitical gray zone. And in order to increase their security, they should unite in an alliance, maybe even in some sort of union, that if they get together, this would increase their security. And this was called then Intermarium, the land between the seas, because it was referring to the countries between the Baltic, Black and Adriatic seas. And in a way, I think this would be also today sort of a natural thing to do. I think if you look sort of from a distance on today's Eastern Europe, what the security situation is, then an East European security alliance between member countries of NATO and non-NATO countries in Eastern Europe would be the most natural thing to do. All of these countries, or most of these countries in Eastern Europe, have similar views on East European security. They see Russia as a threat. They are in some sort of conflict with Russia, diplomatic conflicts, economic, military conflicts, and therefore it would seem that it should be in the natural interest of all of these countries to enter an alliance. Unfortunately, however, this is not happening. As we know, there is now the so-called 3C initiative that has just become prominent during President Trump's visit to Warsaw when he visited took part in a summit of this 3C initiative. But this 3C initiative so far is only a structure or a coalition of countries that are in NATO and in the European Union, or at least in one of these two organizations. And therefore, so far, this 3C initiative actually does not increase the security of Eastern Europe, because It basically is a cooperation scheme between countries that have already solved their security issue. The countries that have an unresolved security issue, namely Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova, Azerbaijan could be also put in this category. They are not included in this 3C initiative, and that is a problem. There are a number of reasons for this. I think it has a lot to do with, I would call it strategic provincialism in Eastern Europe, by which I mean that many of the political analysts, diplomats, politicians in Eastern Europe, both in the NATO member countries and in the non-NATO countries, they look, when they think about security, to Brussels, they look to Washington. And because for Washington or for Brussels, an Intermarium is not something that they are talking about, therefore also the East European elites are not talking about it. So they are not actually analyzing their own situation. They are looking for clues from Washington or from Brussels or maybe Berlin or London or Paris. But there are people, of course, for them, an Intermarium is not, an alliance in Eastern Europe is not a topical topic. Therefore, they don't talk about it. And because it's not a topic in Washington and in Brussels, it's also not a topic in Warsaw or in Bucharest. I think that's the main reason for that. Although one could easily imagine a situation in that, let's say, Romania, Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland would be facing enormous security challenges, which neither NATO nor the EU could solve. So, for instance, if Russia continues its advance in a worst-case scenarios into its military advance into Ukraine, that could lead to a collapse of the Ukrainian state, a dive of the hryvnia, and then to mass immigration to large refugee numbers in Eastern Europe. And it's not quite clear what, for instance, NATO could do in such a case. If millions of Ukrainian refugees flee from Ukraine, from a collapsing Ukrainian state into Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania, it's not quite clear what would NATO do then? Shoot the refugees at the border or what? So although this is obviously an issue, or should be an issue for Eastern Europe, for the East European NATO member countries, they do not perceive it really as a challenge, because it's not something that is discussed in Washington and Brussels or Berlin, and therefore it's also not discussed there. The second issue is a misunderstanding about the obligations that the East European NATO members have towards NATO. Often what is said here is that these countries are members of NATO, and therefore they cannot take upon themselves security obligations with other countries. But that is not the case, of course. The US has gone into a whole number of security treaties around the world within its major non-NATO ally scheme, and has given security guarantees to South Korea, to Israel, to Egypt, to Australia, and all sorts of countries. And the US is a NATO member. There's also now a precedent for a non-nuclear NATO member, namely Turkey, that has given in 2010 to a non-NATO country security assurances, far-reaching security assurances. I would even call them security guarantees in what is called a strategic partnership treaty to Azerbaijan. So there's a treaty signed in 2010 between Turkey and Azerbaijan, which is also by now a ratified treaty. And in Article 2 of this treaty, the two parties agree that they would consult each other in the case of a military attack on one of the parties, on either Azerbaijan or Turkey, and they would then discuss military assistance to each other. And here, of course, the major issue is military assistance of Turkey to Azerbaijan, and less so of Azerbaijan to Turkey. So there is a precedent for this, and the interesting thing here is not only that Azerbaijan is not a NATO member country, but that Azerbaijan is also a post-Soviet republic. It's a member of the Eastern Partnership Program of the European Union, and it has a territorial conflict in which Russia is indirectly involved. It has a territorial conflict with Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, and Russia is an ally of Armenia, officially and unofficially, and therefore Azerbaijan is basically in a similar conflict in which Ukraine is, or Georgia is, and therefore this treaty could be actually a precedent for such security guarantees from East European NATO member countries towards, for instance, Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova. But this is not something well acknowledged and widely discussed. Most analysts in Eastern Europe, I think they believe that NATO membership for Poland, Slovakia, Hungary and Romania means that these countries cannot give any security guarantees outside NATO. This is clearly not true. We have the precedents. And the third problem here is it's a more specific problem between Ukraine and Poland, and that is the memory issue, the memory of World War II, and the strains that, especially during the last 3 years, but already under Yushchenko, have emerged between Poland and Ukraine concerning the memory, above all, of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgents Army, and of course the Volyn massacre. And the problem here is that in such an Intermarium alliance, the crucial axis would be, of course, the Warsaw-Kyiv axis. These are the two major actors in this area, and as long as these two countries cannot develop a more fruitful relationship, a more friendly, a more as long as there is not more solidarity from Poland for Ukraine, I think it will be difficult to come to this sort of larger agreement. So these are the three problems with the Intermarium. But I think I continue. I've raised the issue, and others have raised the issue of the Intermarium several years ago, and it's been in the press for a long time. And I could continue raising it because I think if you look from a distance on Eastern Europe, I think it's the most natural thing to do. These are all countries that have similar perceptions of a Russian threat. They have similar historic experiences. They have feelings of empathy, solidarity towards each other. They are basically ready to do that, but for the reasons I just mentioned, they are not doing it. And I think that is a big problem because it leaves Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova in this geopolitical gray zone, and that is not good, as the last years have clearly shown. So maybe I finish on that.